From what you've seen in the organisations that you've seen it pushed in, what scope do you think there would be of a public inquiry? Because I suppose where you're sitting as a psychologist or formerly training psychologist, you were concerned about the physical harms that were being caused to children. They were green-lighted through medical transition when reporting gender dysphoria. What organisations do you think ought to issue a public inquiry, and what chances do you think of a public inquiry given the scale of the harms and how many people were complicit in them?
I want to see a public inquiry, and I think it's the only thing that will allow us to truly take stock of what's happened and ensure that this is never allowed to happen again. I was calling for it under the last government. I had actually pulled together a letter that I wrote to Rishi Sunak. It had hundreds of signatories, including politicians from across the political spectrum, peers in the House of Lords, doctors, mental health practitioners, some big heavy hitters like J.K. Rowling and others signing it. And I sent that to Rishi. I actually had a meeting in number 10 Downing Street about it. It looked as if maybe there was something there. And then he called the general election, and look where we've ended up now. And there is precisely zero chance of a public inquiry happening under this government.
Yes, I'd probably agree. And maybe we should linger on that change of government for a moment. So let's go back to some of the points you were making earlier on about how it seemed the tides were changing. We've had institutional inquiries into the use of things like puberty blockers and what they call gender affirming healthcare. So we had first the CAS review was commissioned that recommended adopting a more therapeutic approach for children instead of initiating permanent gender transition that begin with puberty blockers. And the reason for that is they say this causes temporary permanent brain mutation. And then there was uproar against it, right? I don't know if people had read the report, but here they are. Everyone talks about wanting experts, and then some experts come along, produce a report, and they say don't want to listen to it. And then there was a bit of a pushback, and there were people saying we don't want to listen to the findings of the CAS report, and we think it's unlawful. And so then it went through the High Court, as we mentioned earlier on, and that High Court said that was a perfectly lawful ruling. I guess we must be careful here, knowing that we sit here in Britain, and we've got a government which is now clamping down on any speech that could be legal, but also harmful. Hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, a whole gamut of words. So we'll have to be as careful as we can here. But what do you think this current Labour government, the supporting cast of NGOs who push this kind of ideology, are willing to do to keep turning away from the latest report, the findings and advice? What mechanisms do you think will be used to keep pushing it ahead? Or do you think that there will be an acceptance of that High Court ruling?
I think, well, I'll kind of take the Labour Party and separately to kind of activist groups, although there is a lot of crossover. But I mean, for these kind of activist groups, they'll stop at nothing to try and stop pushback against this. When the last government released the guidance, in the schools guidance for transgender students, there was a lot of good stuff in there. I mean, it didn't go far enough as far as I and others were concerned, and it should have been put on a formal statutory footing. But, it was pretty good. And it was moving away from this notion that it existed before, that, teachers could be kind of complicit in keeping secrets from children's parents about them, transitioning in school, and also the type of things they're being taught as part of the curriculum. So there's some good stuff in that. I went undercover to some sessions for educational leaders, including, I think there were some school governors and even head teachers on this training. And they were essentially being encouraged to simply ignore the guidance altogether because it was just that, guidance. It wasn't mandated by legislation. Similarly, I sat in on some training organised by the British Psychological Society. And again, one would have thought that in light of the CAS review, they would have really taken stock of that and the ways in which they've been complicit in pushing this ideology in the past. But they didn't. And one of their senior leaders essentially said that because Hilary Cass is cisgender and straight, that she's simply pushing a quote unquote heteronormative bias. I mean, that a clinical psychologist can try and undermine a thorough piece of research like this on that basis is very worrying. So I don't think they'll stop at anything. In terms of the Labour Party themselves, they're trying to back both horses. We've seen some good stuff, like Wes Streeting, the health secretary, seems to have suggested that he will go with the puberty blocker ban that the last government initiated. So that's positive to see. And he's spoken highly of the Cass review himself. But equally, this government has pledged in the King's Speech to ban quote-unquote conversion therapy, which will have serious negative consequences.
And James, what do they mean by conversion therapy? Or in fact, in the therapeutic profession, what do you think they mean by conversion therapy?
Well, they can't mean anything that we would typically associate with the term conversion therapy, like beatings or corrective rape or electric shock therapy or whatever, because all of those things, thankfully, have been outlawed a long time ago. That's you can't go around electrocuting people in the United.
Was that actually where the term came from, and that was its history?
Yes. Because and it was specifically linked to people trying to change the sexuality of people. I mean, there was some abhorrent stuff that went on in the past. There is no doubt about that. The problem is now that we are going to swing far too far in the other direction. So really, when people use that term nowadays, what they are getting at is talking therapy and conversations between religious leaders and their congregation. That is what would be caused by this new legislation. And it very well could risk criminalizing ethical explorative therapy between therapists and vulnerable children struggling with a mental health condition. So I mean, it was actually the conversion therapy stuff that was the catalyst for everything that happened to me, because the petition that I started to the government back in 2021 was asking them essentially not to go ahead with that legislation. And here we are years later, a new government, and they're pushing forward with it. So I'm really concerned to see that. I'm waiting to see the wording of this draft legislation. But as far as I'm concerned, there is no way to word this in a manner that won't have serious negative consequences. So, and then Starmer himself is a bloody, I mean, we can't get away from the facts. Whatever else he says now, he said not so long ago that 1 in 1,000 women have a penis. I mean, how can someone like that be trusted? And he's made pledges in the past that he wants to make misgendering people a hate crime. So, Lord only knows what's going to happen over the next few years under this government.
Yes, well, after 48 days or whatever it is, I think, things are feeling different, certainly. And I think people would, for all of the Tory government's foibles over the last 14 years, I think commentators of any stripe would agree that they never really felt the way they do now with regards to looking over their shoulder about what they say, no matter how carefully worded and analogous. Yes, it's the practical consequences of conversion therapy not being allowed then is effectively a way of fast tracking kids straight to the medical transition. It's saying, no, that there's no point in doing the talking therapy. This is not good. It's unethical because we're stopping the child from realizing who it is they're truly meant to be. And so this is just another way of getting around these rulings. Is that effectively what this is aimed at?
Well, that's what I believe it's aimed at in terms of what they would say. Well, yes, they would say, and this is the language that's often used. I've seen legislation passed in other jurisdictions. They say you are suppressing somebody's gender identity. If you come from a point of view that sex is binary and immutable, you cannot change your sex, then this whole thing becomes a nonsense in and of itself. You've got gender dysphoria, a mental health condition. There is some sort of mismatch between how people are feeling and the body they're in, which is not uncommon. I mean, there's lots of other mental health conditions like that. Think about eating disorders, think about body dysmorphia, where people hate parts of their body. The answer is not to give them liposuction or chop off limbs. It's to help them to accept themselves. It may be difficult to accept themselves. There's parts of myself I don't like. There's parts of my body I don't like. I say this sometimes. When I was a teenager, I wanted to have a bloody nose job because I was, I had/have a pretty voluptuous nose, and I had people taking the piss at school, and I thought, well, maybe I had plastic surgery. I'm very thankful I didn't. But so this is a common theme amongst human beings. But the problem is we've created this distinction between one's biological sex and one's legal sex. That's what this piece of legislation called the Gender Recognition Act 2004 did, which allows people to apply for a gender recognition certificate, which under the law will legally change their sex marker. And that's obviously completely ludicrous. We've now set the tone that there are different types of sex. There aren't. Your sex is your sex, and that's it. So I think that legislation needs to be repealed altogether. But that's kind of what's allowed us to go down this path now, where we're finding the government wanting to have legislation specifically referencing concepts like gender identity, which are these kind of nebulous postmodernistic concepts that don't really mean anything.